Zalika moved through the kitchen with quiet grace, her hands working tirelessly as the scent of slow-cooked stew filled the air. She had spent the entire day preparing, carefully choosing the freshest ingredients, seasoning every dish just the way he liked. The spices blended into a perfect harmony, the aroma wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. This meal had to be special. It had to be perfect. Maybe tonight things would change. Little Mosey and Naya sat nearby, their wide eyes watching as their mother hummed a soft tune, setting the table with care. She placed each plate gently, smoothing out the cloth as if she were handling something sacred. The flickering candlelight reflected in their innocent faces, making them look almost like spirits caught between hope and fear. They had seen this scene play out many times before, the quiet preparation, the waiting, the hope in their mother's eyes, and yet they never knew how the night would end. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a golden glow bathed the small home, painting everything in warm, gentle hues. Zalika took a deep breath, smoothing down her dress, trying to push away the weight pressing against her chest. She wanted to believe that tonight would be different. Maybe he would notice the effort she had put in. Maybe he would smile, say thank you, reach for her hand instead of turning away. Outside, heavy footsteps approached, breaking the fragile silence. The front door creaked open. Khamari had returned. Zalika straightened up, forcing a soft smile onto her lips. The children held their breath. The house, once filled with the warmth of a perfect dinner, suddenly felt colder. Khamari pushed the door open with more force than necessary, his expression twisted in frustration. The long day had drained him, and the weight of his troubles clung to his shoulders like an unbearable burden. He barely acknowledged the warm glow of the lanterns or the neatly set table. The aroma of home-cooked food filled the air, but it did nothing to soften his mood. He muttered something under his breath, shaking his head as he pulled out a chair and dropped into it with a heavy sigh. Zalika watched him carefully, searching his face for a sign, any sign, that tonight would not be like the others. She waited for a glance, a nod, even a tired sigh of appreciation, but none came. He picked up his spoon, scooped a bite of the stew, and placed it in his mouth. For a second, there was silence. Then, his face twisted in disgust. His hand tightened around the spoon, and before anyone could react, he slammed his plate down onto the table with a loud crack. His voice cut through the air like a whip. "Too much salt," he barked. The accusation hung there, heavy and sharp. Zalika's lips parted, an apology forming before she could stop herself. But she never got the chance to finish. Khamari was already on his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. His hand moved faster than thought, striking her across the face with enough force to make the room spin. The sound of the slap echoed through the small home, silencing even the flickering flames of the lanterns. The children gasped, their tiny bodies stiff with fear. Mosey reached for his sister's hand under the table, his grip tight as if holding onto her could somehow make the moment disappear. Naya pressed her lips together, afraid to make a sound, afraid to move. Zalika stumbled, but did not fall. Her body swayed from the impact, but she found her balance, standing tall, shoulders squared. Her skin burned where his palm had landed, but she did not lift a hand to touch it. She did not flinch. She did not scream. She did not cry. Khamari stood there, breathing heavily, expecting something. Tears, pleading, an argument, anything. But Zalika remained still, her face unreadable, her eyes empty. The silence unsettled him in a way he could not explain. His fingers twitched at his sides as he shifted uncomfortably, as if he were waiting for a reaction that never came. The children did not move. The walls seemed to shrink. The room, once filled with warmth, now felt hollow. Zalika turned away, not to hide her pain, but to take control of it. She bent down, picking up the broken plate piece by piece, her movements slow and deliberate. The shards bit into her fingers, drawing thin lines of red, but she did not stop. She gathered every fragment with the same care she had used to set the table, as if cleaning up broken things was second nature. Khamari scoffed, rubbing his jaw as he sank back into his chair. He grabbed another plate, scooped up more stew, and ate in silence. The tension in the air was thick, but he ignored it, pretending that nothing had happened, that this was just another evening in his home. Mossy and Nia kept their eyes down, their small hands clenched in their laps. The food before them was untouched. Neither of them dared to move. Zalika carried the broken pieces to the corner, placing them down gently before returning to the table. She poured him a glass of water, her hands steady. Then, without a word, she sat down and continued eating. The silence stretched between them, growing heavier with each passing second. Khamari chewed slowly, his anger fading into something else, something he couldn't quite name. His wife sat across from him, unshaken, untouched by the storm he had unleashed. For the first time in his life, he felt something close to fear, not of her, but of what he did not understand. Zalika did not move at first. The sting of the slap still burned on her skin, but she did not lift a hand to soothe it. She did not flinch, did not step back, did not cry. She stood there, her back straight, her breathing steady. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, wrapping around the room like an invisible force. The children remained frozen, their small hands gripping the edges of the table. Mosey's wide eyes darted between his mother and father, his lips pressed into a thin, pale line. Naya swallowed hard, her little fingers tightening around her spoon. They had seen their mother hurt before, but this time, something was different. Without a word, Zalika bent down and began picking up the broken plate. The sharp edges of the ceramic bit into her fingertips, but she handled them with care, collecting each piece as if they were fragile relics. She moved with slow, deliberate precision, her face unreadable. Khamari watched her, waiting. His breath was still uneven, his chest rising and falling as the heat of his anger lingered. He expected her to cry, to protest, to plead with him, but she didn't. She simply carried the broken shards to the corner of the room, setting them down with quiet grace. The silence unnerved him. It gnawed at the edges of his mind like a whisper he couldn't quite hear. He wanted her to say something, to react, to give him a reason to continue justifying his anger, but she gave him nothing. Scoffing, he leaned back in his chair, pretending to be unaffected. "You think silence will change anything?" he muttered under his breath, stabbing his spoon into his stew. He chewed slowly, forcing himself to focus on the food, but it tasted different now, bitter, empty. Zalika returned to the table, moving as if nothing had happened. She reached for the pot and gently refilled the children's plates, her hands steady. Mosey and Naya sat stiffly, unsure whether they should eat or remain still. They waited for their mother's permission, their tiny hearts thudding in their chests. She met their eyes and gave them the faintest nod. It was not permission, it was reassurance, a silent message that told them she was still here, still standing, still in control of herself. Mosey hesitated before taking a small bite, his hands trembling around his spoon. Nia followed, her gaze flickering between her mother and father. Khamari let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Acting like nothing happened, huh?" His voice held an edge, but there was something else beneath it, something close to doubt. Zalika did not respond. She simply lifted her own spoon and took a slow, measured bite. His fingers tapped against the table, his irritation shifting into something deeper, something uncomfortable. He had always been able to predict her, control her reactions, shape the outcome of every argument. But now, sitting across from this silent woman, he felt like he was losing his grip on something invisible, yet powerful. He cleared his throat, pushing his bowl away. "Maybe next time you'll pay more attention to how much salt you use," he muttered, trying to regain his dominance over the moment. Zalika calmly reached for his plate and placed it aside. No reaction, no words, just quiet, unwavering acceptance. The air in the room thickened. The children ate in silence, chewing slowly, afraid to make a sound. The only noise was the faint clinking of spoons against ceramic. Khamari shifted in his seat, rubbing his hands together. He hated this feeling. It was like standing in the middle of an open field during a storm, waiting for the lightning to strike. But there was no thunder, no warning, just an eerie stillness that made his skin crawl. "Nothing to say?" He tried again, his voice laced with mock amusement, but even he could hear the strain in his own words. Zalika met his gaze for the first time that night. Her dark eyes held no fear, no anger, just a quiet, unshaken resolve. It was a look that made his stomach tighten. He tore his gaze away, suddenly restless. He grabbed his cup of water and took a long sip, but even that did not ease the strange, twisting sensation in his chest. The meal continued, and Zalika never broke her silence. By the time dinner was finished, Khamari pushed his chair back and stood up, stretching as if the tension in his muscles was just exhaustion from the day. "I'm going to bed," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He walked toward the bedroom, expecting the unease to fade as soon as he left the table. But as he reached the doorway, he paused. The silence followed him, clung to him like a shadow. For the first time in his life, he felt something he couldn't name, and it scared him. Khamari turned onto his side, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling beneath his skin. The room was quiet, except for the rhythmic sound of Zalika's breathing beside him. She lay still, peaceful, as if nothing had happened, as if the night had not been stained with the weight of unspoken words. He closed his eyes, willing himself to sleep, but the moment his mind drifted, he heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost too soft to notice, but it curled through the darkness like smoke, slithering into his ears. His name. Someone was calling his name. His eyes snapped open. The room looked the same, shadows stretching across the walls, the faint glow of the moon seeping through the thin curtains. He held his breath, listening. Nothing. His pulse slowed. It must have been his imagination, a trick of the mind. He exhaled and shifted, turning onto his back. The bed was warm, yet a chill clung to his skin. He glanced at Zalika. She had not moved, her breathing steady, untouched by whatever strange unease had settled over him. He closed his eyes again. The whisper returned. This time, it was closer. It brushed against his ear, cold as the wind before a storm. His body tensed, his fingers curling into the sheets. Slowly, he turned his head, eyes scanning the darkness. His heart pounded. "Zalika," he murmured, barely above a whisper himself. She didn't stir. He reached out, shaking her shoulder. She remained still, deep in sleep. His throat felt dry. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to sit up. The room was empty. Of course, it was empty. He ran a hand down his face, trying to shake off the lingering fear. He lay back down, his body stiff against the mattress. He needed to sleep. He had work in the morning, and he would not let his mind play games with him. But just as he closed his eyes, the whisper came again, right by his ear, soft yet filled with something that made his skin crawl. His breath hitched. His fingers gripped the blanket. He could feel it now, a presence in the room, something unseen but heavy, pressing against the air. He turned his head again, this time staring into the darkest corner of the room. The shadows seemed deeper there, darker than they should be. His body felt frozen, trapped between logic and fear. He wanted to call out to Zalika again, but something held his tongue. The whisper was not hers. It did not belong to anyone in the house. Khamari squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to ignore it. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He just needed sleep. Morning would come, and this strange feeling would disappear with the light. He kept his breathing even, willed his body to relax, and after what felt like an eternity, the whispers faded. But the silence that followed felt even worse. Khamari jolted awake, his body drenched in sweat. His chest burned, a searing pain that felt as though hot embers were pressing into his skin. Gasping, he threw the blankets aside and sat up, clutching his chest. His fingers trembled as they ran over his skin, and a deep sense of unease settled in his stomach. Something was wrong. The room was quiet, but the weight of the night still lingered in the air. The whispers, had they been a dream, a hallucination? He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. He needed to focus on the pain. He needed to see what was happening to him. With hurried steps, he crossed the room and stood before the mirror. His breath hitched. Right over his heart, a dark mark had appeared on his skin. The shape was strange, twisted, unfamiliar, yet it felt ancient, like something that did not belong in this world. It was not a bruise. It was not a wound. It was something else entirely. His fingers hovered over it before pressing against the mark. The moment he touched it, pain shot through his body like lightning. He stumbled back, his chest heaving, sweat dripping from his forehead. His pulse pounded in his ears. He turned back to the mirror, his eyes widening in horror. The mark was darker now, almost pulsing as if it were alive. His breathing grew unsteady. His mind raced. This was impossible. This didn't make sense. He had no injuries, no reason for this to be here. The whispers from the night before crept back into his mind. The cold, ghostly voices that had slithered into his ears. Was this connected? Had something followed him from his nightmares? A chill crawled up his spine. A presence lingered behind him. He turned sharply. Zalika stood in the doorway, silent. Her eyes were unreadable, dark pools that held no fear, no surprise. She simply watched him. Khamari's throat tightened. He wanted to say something, to ask her if she saw it too, if she knew what was happening to him, but no words came out. She stepped forward, slow, deliberate. The morning light cast a glow on her face, making her features seem sharper, more defined. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze drifting to his chest, where the mark burned against his skin. His pulse quickened. Did she know something? Did she see it too? Zalika. His voice came out weaker than he intended. What is this? She did not answer right away. Instead, she studied him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm, almost detached. You should get dressed. The day is waiting. Her words felt strange, almost like a dismissal, as if the mark meant nothing, as if nothing had changed. Khamari clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling beneath his fear. Did she not see what was happening to him? Could she not feel the weight of something unnatural pressing down on him? He wanted to demand answers, to shake her out of her eerie calmness, but something about her presence made him hesitate. Zalika turned, walking away without another word. He stood there, heart racing, staring at the empty doorway. The air felt heavy, thick with something he couldn't name. He turned back to the mirror, staring at his reflection, at the cursed mark now burned into his skin. He did not know what was happening, but deep down, he knew one thing. This was only the beginning. Khamari sat on the edge of the bed, his breath shallow, his fingers hovering over the strange mark on his chest. It still burned, a dull, throbbing heat spreading through his skin. His reflection in the mirror looked different now, his face paler, his eyes darker, shadowed with something he did not want to name, fear. His mind raced, searching for answers, for logic, for something that could explain what was happening to him. But nothing made sense. And then, like a whisper from the past, a voice curled through his memory, soft yet sharp. A woman who does not fight back is the most dangerous. His grandmother's words. He could still see her, sitting by the fire, her wrinkled hands weaving stories from a time long before his own. She spoke of spirits, curses, and vengeful women who never raised their voices, never lifted their hands, because they didn't need to. The witch of the silent moon, she had said one night, her voice barely above a whisper. She does not scream, she does not beg, she waits. Khamari had laughed then, shaking his head at the old tales. What kind of witch does nothing? He had scoffed. His grandmother's eyes had darkened. A patient one. Now, as he sat in the dim morning light, his chest burning, his mind twisted with doubt, could Zalika have done something to him? Could she be like the women from those old stories? He clenched his jaw, shaking his head. Number. This was foolish. He did not believe in spirits. He did not believe in curses. But then, why did his hands tremble? Why did the air feel heavier? He forced himself to stand, to push past the growing dread coiling in his stomach. He needed to focus. He needed to think. Outside the bedroom, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Usually, the children would be making noise, their laughter or chatter filling the air. But now, silence pressed against the walls. He stepped into the hallway, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. The smell of morning stew lingered, the scent of spices thick in the air. Zalika was in the kitchen, her back turned to him as she stirred the pot, her movements slow, methodical. For a moment, he just watched her. She had not spoken much since last night. She had not mentioned his outburst, had not reacted to his anger, his violence. Instead, she had simply continued, as if nothing had happened, as if he had become invisible, and that terrified him more than anything. Zalika. His voice came out rough, almost hesitant. She did not turn. He swallowed, stepping closer. The floor creaked under his weight, but she remained still. He felt like a child again, standing before his grandmother's fire, listening to tales that sent chills down his spine. The woman who waits, the woman who does not scream. He had always thought strength was in power, in control, that the loudest voice was the one that ruled. But now, standing in the quiet house, staring at the woman who had not shed a single tear, he realized something. He had never been in control. The thought made his chest tighten, his fingers curl into fists. He did not like this feeling, this uncertainty, this fear. Something is wrong with me, he admitted, his voice quieter now. Zalika finally turned. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something he had never noticed before. Not sadness, not pain, something deeper. Understanding. She wiped her hands on a cloth, stepping closer, her gaze never leaving his, and then, with a calmness that sent shivers down his spine, she spoke. The past never leaves Khamari. Her words hung in the air, heavy, thick with meaning. He wanted to demand answers, to shake her, to make her tell him what was happening to him, but he didn't, because deep down, he already knew. The night stretched long and unforgiving. Darkness settled thick over the house, pressing against the walls, seeping into every corner. Khamari lay in bed, his body stiff, his mind restless. The burning mark on his chest had not faded. If anything, it felt hotter, as if something unseen had pressed fingers of fire against his skin. Then, the whispers came. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. He barely noticed them, thinking they were tricks of his exhausted mind. But they grew louder, clearer, low voices curling around his name, stretching it, distorting it. Khamari. His breath hitched. He turned his head, scanning the darkness. But the room was still. Zalika lay beside him, her face serene, her breathing slow and steady. He reached out, shaking her shoulder. Zalika. She didn't move. His fingers pressed harder. Zalika, wake up. Nothing. It was as if she had slipped into something deeper than sleep, something beyond his reach. His heart pounded. Then, in the farthest corner of the room, a shadow shifted. Khamari froze. A shape, blacker than the night itself, slithered along the walls. Its form twisted, flickering like a dying flame. It had no face, yet he felt its eyes on him, watching, waiting. Another whisper, closer now. His name, dragged through the air in a voice that was both human and not. His pulse roared in his ears. He sat up, his breathing uneven, sweat sliding down his temples. He told himself it was a nightmare, that if he closed his eyes, it would all disappear. But he couldn't close his eyes, because now there were more. Dark figures moved in every corner of the room, creeping along the walls, pressing against the ceiling. Eyes, glowing red, burning like embers, stared at him from the shadows. The whispers became a chorus, overlapping, filling the space with a sound that made his skin crawl. He scrambled out of bed, nearly stumbling in his haste. The moment his feet hit the floor, the figures twitched, shifting toward him. Cold fingers of terror wrapped around his throat. He turned to Zalika again, shaking her desperately. "Zalika, wake up!" Still, she did not stir. It was as if she were lost in a world he could not reach, her body untouched by the terror clawing at him. His breath came in ragged gasps. He backed away, his legs weak beneath him. The shadows moved closer, their whispers wrapping around him like unseen hands. Khamari. He clenched his fists, his mind racing for answers. What did they want? Why were they here? And then, a voice, different from the others. Not a whisper, not a murmur, a laugh, low, amused. It sent a shudder through his spine. The figures stilled, their glowing eyes locked onto him. The laughter grew, curling around the room, as if the darkness itself found pleasure in his fear. Khamari's hands trembled. His chest burned hotter, the mark pulsing like a heartbeat. He had to get out. Stumbling toward the door, he yanked it open, expecting the safety of the hallway. But what lay beyond was not his home. The corridor stretched endlessly, swallowed in darkness. The walls pulsed, as if alive, the floor shifting beneath his feet. He took a step back, his stomach twisting. This was not real. It couldn't be real. Yet the pain in his chest, the terror in his veins, told him otherwise. The whispers swelled, rising into something sharp, a wailing chorus of voices that did not belong to this world. Khamari squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his hands over his ears. "Leave me alone." The laughter stopped. Silence swallowed the room. He opened his eyes, his breath shaking. The shadows were gone. The whispers had vanished. The hallway was back to normal. Zalika still lay on the bed, untouched by the chaos. Khamari stood in the silence, his body trembling. But he knew deep down that this was not over. The night was only beginning. Khamari's feet pounded against the earth as he ran, his breath ragged, his heart slamming against his ribs. The village was asleep, the houses quiet under the watchful gaze of the moon. But he had no time to care. The whispers still echoed in his mind. The memory of those glowing eyes seared into his soul. He stumbled into Babatau's hut, nearly collapsing onto the floor. The old man sat by a small fire, his eyes wise, his expression calm, as if he had been expecting him. "Babatau, please, help me," Khamari gasped, gripping his chest where the cursed mark still burned. His fingers trembled as he pulled at his tunic, revealing the dark symbol. "Something is haunting me. I don't know what to do." Babatau's gaze fell on the mark, and his face darkened. A heavy sigh escaped his lips. "The spirits have come for you," he murmured. Khamari's stomach twisted. "What spirits?" The elder poked at the fire, sending embers floating into the night air. "The spirits of her ancestors." Khamari's breath hitched. "Zalika's." Babatau nodded, his wrinkled face unreadable. "You have wronged your wife, and now justice is being demanded. His voice was calm, yet it carried the weight of something ancient, something far beyond Khamari's understanding. Khamari felt his knees go weak. He clutched the elder's robe, desperation twisting his face. I didn't mean... Babatao held up a hand, silencing him. It is not for me to judge. The spirits have already made their decision. Khamari's pulse thundered in his ears. Then how do I stop this? There must be a way. Babatao exhaled slowly, looking deep into the fire. For a moment, it seemed like he wouldn't answer. Then, finally, he spoke. Only she can choose to forgive you. The words struck Khamari like a blow. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Forgiveness from Zalika, the woman he had struck, the woman he had humiliated, the woman he had never once truly valued. Would she? Could she? He thought of her silence that night, the way she had calmly picked up the broken pieces of his anger. He had mistaken it for submission. But now he saw it for what it truly was. Power. Zalika had not fought back, not because she was weak, but because she didn't need to, because she had something far greater standing behind her, something older than him, stronger than him, the spirits of those who would not allow injustice to go unanswered. Khamari swallowed hard. The fire crackled between them, casting shadows across Babatao's face. The elder studied him for a long moment, then placed a firm hand on his shoulder. If you truly seek forgiveness, he said, you must be prepared to face the weight of what you have done. Khamari nodded, though fear still gripped him. He had no other choice. If he wanted to survive, if he wanted the voices to stop, the shadows to leave him be, he had to do what he had never done before. He had to bow his head. He had to beg for mercy. And this time, no amount of power, no amount of pride could save him from the judgment that awaited. Khamari burst through the door, his breath ragged, his chest still burning with the cursed mark. The house was silent, the air thick with something he could not name. He stumbled forward, his knees buckling beneath him as he collapsed at Zalika's feet. His hands gripped the hem of her dress, his head bowed, his voice shaking. Zalika, please, forgive me. She did not move. The children sat quietly in the corner, their wide eyes watching, their small bodies tense. Even they could feel the weight of this moment, the shift in power, the reversal of roles. Khamari looked up, his face lined with terror, his pride shattered. I was wrong, he choked out. I was cruel. I hurt you. I should have never. His voice broke, his forehead pressing against the ground. Please, make it stop. For the first time in his life, he was the one trembling, the one afraid, the one at the mercy of someone else. Zalika slowly rose from her seat. Her movements were graceful, deliberate, untouched by the desperation that consumed him. She stepped back, away from his grasp, forcing him to lift his head to meet her gaze. Her eyes were unreadable, deep, dark pools that held no pity, no anger, no warmth, only truth. You struck me without fear, she said, her voice calm, measured. Now you fear what you cannot see. Khamari's body shuddered. He wanted to plead, to explain, to promise that he would change, but the words felt empty, meaningless, because for the first time, he understood. His fear was not of Zalika. It was of the justice he could not escape. She turned away, her back to him, her presence stronger than any force he had ever faced. And in the suffocating silence of that moment, Khamari finally knew. This was not just about forgiveness. This was about consequence, and there was no running from it anymore. Khamari lay on the mat, drenched in sweat, his body rigid with fear. The whispers were relentless, circling him like vultures, growing louder with each passing second. The darkness of the room was not just the absence of light. It was alive, shifting, creeping, pressing against his skin. He clutched his chest as the mark burned hotter, the pain unlike anything he had ever known. It wasn't the sharp sting of a wound or the ache of bruised flesh. It was something deeper, something that clawed at his soul, unraveling him from the inside. His breaths came in short gasps. He turned his head, searching for Zalika. She lay still, her face serene, untouched by the horror that gripped him. He wanted to reach for her, to beg again, to plead for mercy, but something stopped him. She had not spoken a word to him since he had fallen to his knees before her. She had not cursed him, had not raised a hand, had not so much as looked at him with hate. And yet, he was the one suffering. The shadows in the room thickened, their shapes twisting into figures, tall, faceless beings with glowing red eyes. They stood at the corners, watching, whispering his name in voices that belonged to no one and everyone. Khamari's body convulsed as the pain in his chest intensified. the marks searing through his skin like fire. He tried to scream, but his voice failed him. His limbs were heavy, his strength drained. This was not just torment, this was judgment. He squeezed his eyes shut, hoping it would stop, but the moment he did, a vision flashed in his mind. His grandmother's voice, the stories she used to tell. A woman who doesn't fight back is the most dangerous. He had laughed then. He had dismissed her tales of the silent moon, of the spirits that watched over those who suffered in silence. But Zalika had known. She had known all along. The truth crashed over him like a tidal wave. His strength had always been an illusion, his dominance, a fragile thing. He had mistaken silence for weakness. He had thought fear only belonged to those who were beaten, to those who had no power to fight back. But he had never been more wrong. Zalika had never needed to raise her voice. She had never needed to lift a hand. She had let the universe decide his fate. And now, it was too late to undo what had already been set in motion. The shadows moved closer. The whispers became unbearable. The mark on his chest burned hotter, deeper, sinking into his very being. And as the moon cast its pale glow through the window, Khamari finally understood. The strongest person in the house had never been him. It had always been the woman he had underestimated. Real power doesn't scream. It doesn't strike. It watches and waits. Khamari thought he was in control until the whispers came. How many Zalikas suffer in silence? How many stories go unheard? If this moved you, don't let it end here. Watch the next video, subscribe, like, and share. Some truths deserve to be seen.